"Stand behind me now," said the rancher when her uncle raised the whip again. The whip was a coachman's rig, thick braided leather with a weighted popper on the end, and Harlan Prout kept it coiled on a nail by the barn door the way other men kept a hat. I noticed it the first week I bought the alderman place, when I rode the fence line to learn where my land ended and Prout started. He was working his niece in the vegetable rows, the girl maybe 19 or 20 on her knees in the turned earth. A hard morning, frost still on the low ground. She had a basket beside her, and she was pulling the last of the fall beets, and she straightened up, maybe to rest her back, maybe to reach further down the row. I couldn't see from where I sat my horse. And he reached back to that nail without even looking, and the whip cracked once against the packed dirt 2 feet from her boots. She didn't flinch. That was the thing that stayed with me, not the crack of the whip, not Prout's face, which I couldn't see clearly at that distance. What stayed with me, what I turned over for days after, was how still she was when it came. She'd learned not to flinch. You learn that by practice, and practice is ugly, and what it means is that this wasn't new, and it wasn't rare. And she'd spent whatever time it took, days, probably weeks, working herself down to that particular stillness, because flinching cost her something and she decided not to pay it anymore. She went back to the beets. That was the other part. She went back to them like she'd just shifted her weight. I rode on. That's the truth of it. I told myself it wasn't my land and it wasn't my business, and I had 43 head to move to the north pasture before the first frost. I told myself that, and I believed it for approximately as long as it took me to get back to my barn and pull the saddle off my horse. I'm not going to dress that up into something noble. My name is Callum Greer. I was 51 years old that autumn, though I felt older most mornings, the way a man does when he's been running on a kind of hollow momentum for a few years. I'd come to the Cotter Valley 8 months prior with a bill of sale for 312 acres, a string of 7 horses, and not a soul on earth who needed to know where I'd gone. My wife had been dead 4 years. Her name was Ruth, and she'd been sick for 2 years before that, a slow sick, the kind that takes its time, and I'd done right by her. I stayed, I kept the place running. I kept showing up, but there's a particular way that kind of slow grief wears a man down. Not into nothing, into something narrower. Some portion of himself gets sealed off because that's the only way he keeps functioning. You get competent, you get capable, you get very quiet, and after a while the quiet is all you know. My son Thomas was grown and living in Denver, and we got along well enough at a distance, which is the way some fathers and sons are suited to each other, and nobody takes it personally. I had no particular reason to leave the place I'd been, and no particular reason to stay. I sold it and bought the alderman property in the Cotter Valley on a Tuesday in April, and started driving my horses north the following Thursday. The alderman place was good land, creek-fed, decent house, a barn that needed a new roof on the east side but was sound everywhere else. The previous owner had let the north fences go slack, and there was a drainage problem in the east field I spent 2 full months solving with a spade, and a great deal of time on my knees in the mud. I hired 2 hands for the cattle work, brothers named Paz and Rogelio Vasquez, both in their 30s, steady and competent, and they left me alone unless the work required otherwise, which I respected. We got the cattle through the first season without losses, and I finished the barn roof before the first hard frost, and by October I had the sense that the place was becoming what I'd bought it to be, a working ranch, ordered and functional, asking nothing more of me than my labor and attention, which I had in considerable surplus. The Cotter Valley had maybe 200 souls spread across 6 or 7 ranches, a small town called Garnet with a dry goods, a livery, a church, and a saloon that doubled as the post office on Tuesdays. I went to town when I needed supplies and spoke to whoever spoke first, and was not unfriendly, and did not particularly invite anything beyond that. I wasn't hiding. I just wasn't looking to plant myself in anyone else's life. Prout's ranch was the largest in the valley, maybe 800 acres. though a good portion of that was marginal grazed land he'd bought cheap and run cattle on until they died or he sold them underweight. He was a heavy-set man, dense rather than fat, the kind of body that had been powerfully strong in its 40s and had gone doughy without shedding any of its mass or its habit of taking up space. He had a voice that carried in open air, and a way of using it that told you it had always carried and he'd always known it. Every third word out of his mouth was about what he owned, what he'd built, what other people had failed to understand about his way of doing things. He wasn't loud so much as constantly present. Even when he wasn't in the room, you had the sense he might walk in. I've known men like that. They're not always dangerous, but they're always heavy. His niece was named Mara. I learned her name from Mrs. Aldridge at the dry goods, who mentioned her in the way people mention someone they feel sorry for and haven't done a single useful thing to help. Poor Mara Prout, she said, though she wasn't a Prout by blood, only by her dead mother's marriage to Harlan's brother, who died of a fever 6 years ago and left the girl with nowhere else to go. 18 when she'd arrived at her uncle's house, and now she was 23 or 24 and still there. She keeps that whole place running, Mrs. Aldridge said, wrapping my flour in brown paper. Harlan couldn't balance his own accounts, they say, before she came. She does the books, the garden, the house, half the barn work in season. You'd never know it to hear him. He talks about the operation like it runs on his good judgment. She looked at her counter. I just feel terrible for the girl is all. She handed me my change. She'd felt terrible for the girl for 6 years and handed her change to customers and felt terrible some more. I filed that away and went home and spent the next 2 weeks thinking about it more than suited me. The second time I saw the whip used was in October. I was in Garnet getting a shoe reset on my roan, standing in the livery doorway with a cup of coffee the Aldridge boy had brought me, and Prout came in driving his wagon with Mara on the seat beside him. He wanted the team watered and he wanted it done in a particular way, and he explained that way to young Aldridge twice, very slowly, as though the boy were 8 years old and possibly simple. The boy was 16 and perfectly competent, and I watched him take it with his jaw set, and then go do exactly what he was told. Mara climbed down to help with the near horse. The horse was restless. They'd been on the road for a while and the cold makes them want to move, and when she reached for the bridle he shifted left and she missed the first grab. Nothing unusual. Any horse does that. But Prout said something to her I couldn't hear across the yard, something short and clipped, and then the whip came out from under the wagon seat and he cracked it once in the air beside her shoulder. Not against her. In the air, right at her shoulder height, close enough that the displaced air moved her hair. She caught the bridle on the second try, held the horse steady, stood there looking at the animal's nose. I became aware that I had set down my coffee. I watched Prout put the whip back under the seat, smooth, practiced, like tucking in a tool he used regularly, and then he looked around the yard the way a man looks around when he wants to confirm that what just happened is already past and everyone has moved on. He saw me watching. He nodded at me. Neighbor to neighbor, nothing unusual here, good morning. I nodded back. I picked up my coffee. I finished it. I went home, and that night I sat on my porch after supper with my hands around a cold cup, and didn't go inside for a long time. I was trying to do something honest, not what kind of man I used to be or what kind I like to think I was. What kind of man I was actually being, right now, tonight, in this specific valley, with everything I'd watched. It's a harder question than most men will sit still long enough to ask. I'd been a quiet man for 4 years. That is not the same thing as a peaceful man, and I knew the difference. A peaceful man has genuinely set something down. He's done the work of it, gone through the loss or the failure or the change, and come out on the other side of it with his hands empty, at rest. A quiet man has just stopped talking about it. He's still carrying it, every bit of it, but he's gotten so efficient about the carrying that he can't feel it anymore, and he starts to confuse the absence of feeling with peace, and after a while he stops checking. I'd built a careful order around myself. The work, the horses, the long evenings, the particular way I'd learned to be present for what was needed without being present for anything else. It had worked well enough that I'd stopped questioning it. I was stable. I was capable. I did the work and did it right and didn't owe anyone anything and nobody owed me. I was about as alive as a post in the ground, and I had been telling myself that was fine. I went inside. I went to bed. I lay there for a while looking at the ceiling and then I went to sleep. In November the weather turned hard and I didn't see Mara or Prout for nearly 3 weeks. The valley hunkered down under a gray sky that didn't quite snow and didn't quite clear, everything the color of cold mud. I kept the cattle fed and finished weatherproofing the bunkhouse, and started working a young gray gelding I'd bought at the Durango auction in September. A horse with a good brain and the instinct for cutting work, but still rough on his lead changes. I worked him every day in the round pen until we understood each other, which is about as close to real conversation as I generally get. Then on a Thursday morning, I rode into Garnet for flour and salt and a new axe handle, and I came out of the dry goods to find Mara Prout at the hitching rail trying to get 100-pound grain sack up onto the bed of her uncle's wagon by herself. She had it maybe 4 feet off the ground, braced against her knee, and her arms were shaking not from weakness, from the angle of the thing. The sack was nearly as wide as she was, and it kept wanting to slide sideways, and she kept correcting for it. She'd probably been at it 2 or 3 minutes already. I tied off my horse and walked over and took hold of the bottom of the sack without saying anything. We got it up together in about 4 seconds. She said, "Thank you," looking at the wagon bed, not at me. Her voice was lower than you'd expect, very level. I said, "How many more?" She looked at me then. Dark gray eyes, the color of the sky before it decides to snow, and there was something in them that was doing a great deal of work just below the surface, reading me, measuring, running through some quick calculation about what I was and what I wanted, and what it might cost her if she got the answer wrong. 2, she said. We got the other 2 loaded without talking. She was stronger than she looked, which is to say she was genuinely strong, practical, everyday labor strong, the kind that doesn't announce itself. When the last sack was in, she turned and said, "Mr. Greer." She said it the way you say a name you've taken note of, not just recognized, taken note of. "He's inside," she said. "You shouldn't, he won't like it, you helping." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. She didn't smile, but something shifted at the corner of her mouth, some small adjustment that wasn't a smile and meant more than one probably would have. She went inside and I untied my horse and rode home. I thought about what she'd said the whole way. Not "he won't like it" as a warning about Prout. I already understood what kind of man Prout was, but as a piece of data about her. She'd been looking out for me in the 30 seconds we'd known each other, watching for danger, pointing it at someone else's feet before they could step in it. That was a thing she did, apparently. She did it quietly, without making it about herself. I thought about what it would cost a person, doing that for years in a house where nobody did it back. That sat in my chest for a while in a way I didn't much examine. December came and the real cold came with it. I was working the gray gelding harder now, 2 hours every morning, and the days got their rhythm back, short and cold and full of work, which suited me. The valley was quiet under the frost and I went to town for supplies when I needed them and kept to myself otherwise. I saw Mara 3 more times before Christmas. Always in town, always either moving between errands or standing at her uncle's shoulder while he conducted his business, and she carried out the parts that required accuracy. He'd send her to check a shipping invoice or collect the post, and when she came back with the information he received it, the way a man receives something from a tool he sent to fetch it, without acknowledgement, without thanks, already looking at the thing she'd brought rather than at her. He never used the whip in front of other people. He had enough cunning for that. What he used instead was position and proximity, the way he placed himself between her and anyone who might speak to her, the slight adjustment of his weight when she moved without being directed, The look that wasn't quite a look but that she read correctly every time. She'd learned his signals the way a horse learns a cruel rider's signals, not because she wanted to, but because the cost of missing one was too high. She moved around him flawlessly, smoothly, never bumping against the edge of what he'd permit. It was the most depressing piece of horsemanship I had ever watched, and I'd watched a lot of horsemanship. In January, on a Monday morning with 6 inches of new snow on the ground and the sky still carrying more of it, she rode into my yard. I was in the barn with Paz running the gray gelding through his paces in the center aisle, too cold for the round pen that morning, and I heard hoofbeats on the frozen ground outside and went to the door. She was on a sway-backed old roan I recognized as one of Prute's workhorses, not a riding animal, and she was sitting it bareback. No saddle. A wool shawl over a dress that was not adequate for a January morning in the mountains, not by a long way. The red had already climbed past her wrists. I said Miss Mara, because I knew her name by then too. She said, "Mr. Greer, I'm sorry to bother you. Our beam scale cracked over the weekend and Uncle Harlan needs to weigh the grain shipment by Friday for the railway manifest. I was wondering if we could borrow yours." A perfectly reasonable request to deliver in person, on a workhorse, in the snow, bareback, without a coat. I said, "Come inside." She said, "I only need the scale. I don't want to be a trouble." I said, "The scale's inside. Come in and warm up first." She went through that particular thing I'd started to recognize in her, that brief internal running of figures, checking what a thing said to her actually meant, what it would require, what it might cost her if she got the answer wrong. Then she got down off the horse, which wasn't graceful because the horse was tall and she had to jump for it, and she landed clean and stood up straight. I put Paz back on the gelding and took her inside. The stove was going and I had coffee left from breakfast, and I poured her a cup and set it on the table in front of her. Then I went to the back peg and got my spare coat, the heavy wool-lined one, and brought it out and laid it on the table near her. Not in her hands, just near her where she could see it. She looked at the coat. She looked at me. I said, "Keep it, I've got another." She said, "I can't keep your coat." I said, "Then borrow it. Return it in spring when you don't need it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and held it, and I watched the red start to ease out of her knuckles. We sat in my kitchen in the low winter light, and I asked her about the grain shipment and what the scale requirements were, and she answered in that careful, level voice. And after maybe 15 or 20 minutes, the careful in it came down a notch, not into something warm exactly, but into something less braced. She was not a quiet woman by nature, I found out that morning. She was a woman who had been made to be quiet, which is a different thing entirely. She knew the valley the way you know a place you've been paying close attention to for a long time, not just the geography but the underpinnings, which ranches were solid and which were running on bravado, where the true water rights sat versus where the deeds claimed they sat, which families had been here before any of the Anglo ranches, and what that meant for the arguments that came up about boundaries every spring thaw. She'd had 1 year of schooling before her mother got sick, and she'd been reading whatever she could get hold of since, mostly history, through Mrs. Aldridge's informal practice of lending books left behind by customers. I asked her what she was reading. She told me. Then she stopped and looked at me with that measuring look she had. "Why do you want to know?" she said. Genuine question, no suspicion in it but not naive either. "Because I have books," I said, "and nobody to lend them to." She looked over at the shelf in the corner. About 20 volumes, accumulated across 40 years of moving around and keeping only the ones that mattered enough to carry. She looked at them the way you look at something you want and have spent some time training yourself to stop wanting. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He won't like it." "I know." She took the coat and the scale and rode back. I stood in the barn door and watched her go and stayed there a moment after she was out of sight, my hand on the frame, the cold coming in around me. What I was feeling I put in a drawer and left there. I went back to work. 2 weeks later I left a book for her at the dry goods, an account of the Western expedition, which I thought she'd actually want rather than just be polite about. The part about the maps and the surveying work and the long, careful descriptions of country that nobody had named yet. Just her name on the outside and nothing else. Mrs. Aldridge said she'd see it got to Mara. I didn't know if she would, and I didn't know if Mara would take it if she did. She did. The next time I saw her in town, she walked past me at the hitching rail and I thought she wasn't going to say anything. And then without stopping or looking at me, she said, "It's very good, the surveying parts especially," and kept walking. I felt approximately 17 years old for the better part of a minute. February was when things changed. It had been a wet winter, the kind that keeps the mud working even when it's cold enough to frost at night. And I was in the barn late one evening doing the last feeding, later than usual, because the gray gelding had been slightly off on his left fore, and I wanted to be sure it wasn't more than a stone bruise before I put him away for the night. I had the lantern up on the post, and the horses eating and the barn quiet, and then I heard a horse come in across the yard at a pace that didn't belong to evening. I came out with the lantern. Myra was in the yard on the old roan, leaning forward over the horse's neck, her left arm held close against her body. She pulled up when the light hit her. Got down, and when she straightened I saw it, not a whip welt. Something worse. A strike from the weighted butt end of the handle across the left shoulder and down toward the collarbone, already raised and going dark. I said, "Come inside." She said, "I don't want to make trouble at your door." I said, "Mara, come inside." She came. I boiled water and got the liniment and clean rags, and she sat at my kitchen table, and I tended to it the way you tend to a wound that needs tending, without ceremony, without making it bigger than it was, because the person in front of you doesn't need you to perform your concern, they need you to do the work. She didn't make a sound the whole time I worked on it. Not one. She found a point on the far wall and held it and let me do what needed doing, and when I was done and sat back she said, "Thank you," in that same level voice. A fraction less level than usual, just a fraction. I sat down across from her and looked at the table for a moment. I said, "This isn't the first time." "No," she said. I said, "And it won't be the last time either if nothing changes." She looked at me. Not with any particular hope in it, not asking for anything, just looking. I said, "You could leave the valley." "With what?" she said, not a question, just the two words laid flat. "He owns the horse. He owns the dress I'm wearing, the boots on my feet. He keeps the wages on the books and finds a reason every season not to pay them out. I have $4 I put by from doing accounts for the Sutter Ranch when he wasn't paying attention. That's everything I have." She said it without self-pity, like explaining a fence line. "This is where the boundary is, this is what's on either side." I said, "Then I'll speak to him." She said, "You can't speak to Harlan Pruitt. You can only tell him things and he'll hate you for telling them." "I know," I said. She was quiet. Outside the wind had picked up and the fire shifted in the stove. She said, "Why would you do that?" I didn't have a clean answer that wasn't too much to say out loud. I said what was true and manageable. Because I've been watching from across a fence line for 6 months and calling it minding my own business. I'm tired of that. She looked at me for a long time after. Not the measuring look, not the cautious running of figures. Something else, quieter, like something that had been held in a fist for a long time opening a little. She stayed the night in the spare room, door shut, and I slept on the couch near the stove, and in the morning I made breakfast, eggs, salt pork, the heel of a bread loaf toasted in the pan, and we ate it without much talking, and she said, "I should go back before he notices I'm gone." I said, "If you go back now, he'll think it cost him nothing." She said, "What are you saying?" I said, "Stay here, work here. The books need doing, the house needs managing. I'm not organized about half of what I should be, and I'll pay you what that work is worth. Not what a man decides to call generous, what it's actually worth. You'd have the spare room and your wages, and if Prout wants to say something about it, he can come say it to me." She stared at me. I said, "I'm not suggesting anything other than what I just said." She said, "I know what you're suggesting, I know that." She sat with her hands flat on the table. "I'm asking why, because men they don't offer something for nothing." "It's not for nothing," I said. "You'd be working." "I need the help." She said, "You have Paz and Rogelio." "I need someone who can read and write and manage a ledger, and doesn't look at my filing system like it personally offended them." Something shifted in her face, very small. I thought it might have been humor, though she kept it contained enough that I couldn't be certain. She went back that morning to get her things. She came back before noon with a flour sack that held everything she owned. A change of clothes, 3 books, one of them mine, a hairbrush, her $4, and a small tintype of a woman I took to be her mother. That was the weight of 24 years at Harlan Prout's house. 1 flour sack. I showed her the spare room and put a key to it in her hand, and she stood in the middle of it looking at the 4 walls and the narrow bed, and the window with the frost still on it. And she turned her face away before whatever was happening in it could reach her expression. I left her to it and went out to start the afternoon water. That evening she made supper. I hadn't asked her to, I'd been going to do it myself. The same rotation of things I'd been cooking for 8 months, which was functional if not particularly interesting. But I came in from the barn to find the kitchen smelling like something considerably better than anything that had come out of it since I bought the place. She was at the stove with her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned up, and the particular look of a person doing something they know well and have missed doing for someone who would actually notice. I sat down at the table without saying anything, and she put a plate in front of me without saying anything, and I ate, and it was good, properly good. And I said so. She said, "I know," in a tone that was not modest, and it surprised a laugh out of me before I could catch it. She looked at me like she wasn't entirely sure what to make of that. Then she looked back at her own plate, but not before I caught the edge of something at the corner of her mouth. We ate without much conversation. Outside, the last of the light went off the mountains, and the cold settled in, and the stove ticked. At some point I realized I hadn't sat at a table and eaten a meal that someone else cooked and felt anything about it in years. Not since Ruth. I'd eaten plenty of meals, I wasn't neglecting myself, but I'd eaten them the way you do a task that needs doing, efficiently and without particular attention. This was different. This was a meal in a kitchen with another person in it and the lamp on and the evening coming down outside, and all of it ordinary. And the ordinary of it was the thing. I washed up while she dried and put away, and we didn't talk much. And she went to her room and I went to my end of the house, and the night was quiet, and I slept better than I had in a good while. 3 days later Prout came. I'd been expecting him. I wasn't going to be caught inside when he arrived, so I'd positioned my morning work near the barn fence where I had a clear sight line to the gate. I saw the dust on the road and came out to the fence and stood there, not working, just standing, visible and unhurried, and let him see me before he saw the house. He rode in around mid-morning, just him, no hands with him, which told me he was keeping this quiet for now. He was on his good horse, not the workhorse, which told me he'd thought about the picture he wanted to make. He had the coachman's whip coiled at the saddle horn. He pulled up maybe 12 feet from me. I had my back against the fence and my arms at my sides, and I wasn't holding anything. I'd thought about that. Hands-free reads different than hands occupied, and I wanted him reading everything I meant him to read. He said, "You've got something of mine, Greer." I said, "No." He said, "My niece is in that house." "Miss Mara works for me," I said. "She made a free choice to do so, as a grown woman is entitled to do." He said, "She's family, her place is at home." I said, a home where she worked without wages and got hit with the butt end of a whip handle for something a horse did. She's left that situation, and she won't be going back to it. His face went through several things. Men like Prout don't go immediately to anger, not in the open, not when they don't know exactly what they're dealing with. They calculate first. They figure what they can say and what they can deny and what witnesses are around to hear it. We had no witnesses. That was its own calculation. He said, "You don't know what you're stepping into." I said, "I think I do." He said, "I've been in this valley 12 years. I've got friends here." I said, "So do I." That surprised him. He'd had me figured for a transplant with no roots and no alliances, which had been accurate for most of the past year. But I'd been paying attention, and I knew which men in the valley were solid, and which ones just tolerated Prout because he was large and loud, and it was easier than not. Paz and Rogelio Vasquez had family in the valley going back more than 30 years. The Aldridges were decent people who'd been watching Mara's situation and feeling guilty about it. The Sutter Ranch to my north had a father and 2 grown sons, and they'd had public words with Prout the previous spring over a water line dispute that Prout had handled badly. I wasn't alone, and Prout had just understood that he didn't know exactly how alone I wasn't. He looked at the house, then at me. His jaw worked once. He said, "This isn't finished." "I didn't think it was," I said. He turned his horse and rode out, and I stood there watching the dust on the road and let the yard go quiet again. Then I checked on the gray gelding, who'd been watching the whole thing from his paddock with his ears sharp forward, and went back to my work. When I came up to the house, Mara was in the doorway. She'd been at the window. She said, "You told him I'm staying." "Yes." She was quiet a moment. "He'll come back, not like that, quieter." "I expect so." She looked at me for a moment, her arms folded across her chest in a thinking way, not a closed one. She said, "Thank you," said it once plain, like she didn't intend to say it again, and had put everything into the once. I said, "Go ahead and start on those Sutter accounts whenever you're ready. They looked like a mess to me." She went inside. I heard her at the desk in the office a few minutes later. I went to wash up at the pump, and the afternoon was ordinary, work done, a meal coming, someone in the house who knew what they were doing, and that was more than I'd had in a long time. The trouble started in March, and it came in layers, the way Prout did most things, cautiously, each piece looking like coincidence if you were only looking at each piece. My fence lines along his boundary started coming loose. Not cut, not obviously. Just staples backing out, wire going slack, the kind of deterioration that could be wear and weather if a man was willing to say so with a straight face. 3 of my heifers got through one of those gaps onto his land, and he charged me a recovery fee that was almost twice what any honest man in the valley would have asked. I paid it and fixed the fence and didn't say anything. 2 water rights applications I'd filed with the county came back denied. That had never happened to me in any previous county, and the land agent in Garnet was vague about the reasons in a way that was practiced rather than uncertain. The vagueness of a man who has been given a specific thing to be vague about. In town, people were careful with me. Not unfriendly. Careful. Whatever Prout was saying, he was saying it skillfully, in that particular way he had of presenting his own interests as a reasonable concern a good neighbor would have had to raise. He'd had 12 years to build that kind of credit in the valley, and I'd had less than 2, and there wasn't anything to do about that arithmetic except wait it out. I'm not going to say I was unworried. I lay awake some nights running numbers, and the numbers were not comfortable. The Alderman place had been a solid purchase, but not one with much margin for a sustained campaign, and Prout had the look of a man settling into something he intended to outlast. The recovery fees, the denied applications, the time I was losing to things that weren't cattle or horses, it was going to show up in my books come summer if it didn't resolve. I didn't talk to Mara about it. She was doing the books and she could see the shape of it herself, but I didn't sit down and lay it out for her. Part of that was old habit. I'd been managing my own trouble alone for 4 years, and the habit ran deep. But mostly it was that I didn't want her carrying the weight of it. She hadn't brought it to my door. I'd gone and invited it clear-eyed, and that was mine. She saw through me anyway, which I should have expected. One evening in mid-March, she came and sat across from me at the kitchen table after supper and put a ledger on the table between us that I hadn't seen before. Her handwriting on the cover. She said I kept copies of the accounts I did for him, starting about 2 years ago when I began to understand what he was. She tapped the cover once. He's 3 payments behind on the North Pasture loan. The Durango bank holds the note, and he's been moving money between accounts to cover it, which works until someone looks carefully at the movement. She looked at me. He's not as solid as the Valley thinks he is. He never has been. He's been performing solid for 12 years. I said, "You've had this for 2 years." She said, "I've had it. I didn't know what to do with it that wouldn't get me hurt." She said it without apology, just accurately. I said, "What changed?" She said, "You didn't tell me about the fence cuts." She looked at me, not angry but very direct. I saw the new staples on the east line, and I asked Paz, and he told me what had been happening. "You were managing it alone because you didn't want me to feel responsible." She waited a beat. "That's kind, but I'm not someone you protect from what's happening. I'm someone you bring into it. I keep telling you I'm useful, Callum. Let me be." It was the first time she'd used my given name. I don't know if she noticed. I said, "Show me what you have." We worked for nearly 3 hours that evening. She was better with numbers than I was, which I'd already known, but what I hadn't understood until that night was how well she knew Prute's patterns. Not just the numbers, but the thinking underneath them, where he cut corners, where his confidence in himself outran what the numbers would support. By the time we were done, I had a clearer picture of my position than I'd had in weeks. More than that, I wasn't in it alone. We were in it together, working the same problem from the same side of the table, and that was a different thing entirely from me managing it in one room while she worked in the next and neither of us saying anything. When we were done, she gathered the papers and I said, "Mara." She looked up. "Thank you for this." She looked at the papers in her hands, then at me. "I've been waiting 6 years for somewhere to put it to use," she said. "It's past time." She went to her room. I sat at the table for a while after in the kitchen with the stove ticking and the night pressing against the windows. There is a particular kind of loneliness that is not about being alone. It's about being next to people and none of it touching you, going through the motions of conversation and work and presence while some part of you remains behind glass, untouched. That's what 4 years of carrying Ruth's death the way I'd carried it had done to me. I'd gotten efficient. I'd gotten capable. I'd built my order, and I maintained it, and I told myself, this was what 51 looked like if you'd been through what I'd been through. Something about the way she'd said, "Let me be useful, Callum." Something about the specific quality of sitting at a table working a hard problem with someone who was not performing anything for your benefit and not expecting you to perform anything for hers. Side by side in it together, and the kitchen around us just a kitchen. I hadn't felt that particular thing in a long time. I went to bed, and for once I didn't lie awake. In April, we took the water rights case to the county court in Durango. I'd found a lawyer through the Vasquez family's connections, a man named Brennan, lean and dry-humored, who had dealt with Prute's particular type before, and seemed to find the work genuinely satisfying in a professional way. He came to the ranch to meet us, and Mara laid out her ledger copies and walked him through 3 years of Prute's account movements, while Brennan listened with his hands flat on the table, and his face doing the thing a good lawyer's face does when he's calculating how useful something is. When she was done, he looked at me and raised one eyebrow. I said, "She kept the books." He said, "She kept them very well." He looked back at Mara. "Would you be willing to testify to the method by which you maintained these records and the sources for each entry?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good. Then we have more than a water rights case." He was right. The hearing was a Tuesday in April, cold and clear, and Brennan handled the legal argument and Mara sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, and when Pruitt's lawyer tried to characterize the denied applications as routine administrative process, Brennan produced the ledger copies, and Mara walked the judge through the account movements with a precision and composure that made Pruitt's lawyer ask for a recess after about 20 minutes. The judge gave him 20 minutes and he came back and asked for a continuance, and the judge denied that too. We won. More than that, in the discovery process, the fence cutting came out, and the recovery fees, and the land agent in Garnet who turned out to have been taking a percentage from Pruitt for every application he delayed or denied, which had been going on for 8 years, and had affected 4 other ranches in the valley besides mine. That last part became a county matter with its own wheels that had nothing much to do with me after the initial testimony. Riding back from Durango that evening, just the two of us, the mountains going orange to the west, Mara was quiet for a long stretch. Not the watchful, held-in quiet she'd had when I first knew her. Something different, a thinking quiet, easier in the body. She said, "I didn't know if it would work." I said, "I know." She said, "I thought he'd find a way around it. He always found a way around things before." "Not this time." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I've been frightened for 6 years, not all the time. In the background all the time there was this weight. I got so used to carrying it I stopped noticing it was there." I let that sit. There wasn't anything useful to say to it. After a while she said, "Thank you, Callum." I said, "Mara." She looked at me. "You won that case," I said. "I paid the lawyer and showed up. You won it." She looked back at the road, but I saw her chin come up a small, precise amount, the way it did when she'd received something she intended to keep. The day Brennan's written verdict arrived, I was in the south field checking the spring calves. Rogelio rode out to find me grinning like he'd been given money, which meant word had come ahead of the rider. I read the letter twice standing in the field with a calf nosing at my boot, and then folded it into my coat pocket and rode back to the house. Mara was at the kitchen table going over the Sutter accounts. She looked up when I came in the door, and before I said a word she read my face. She'd learned to read me by then the way she read everything, carefully and patiently, and I watched her shoulders come down 1/4 of an inch. Just that. The body releasing something it had been holding without asking permission. I put the letter on the table. She read it. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she stood up and came across the kitchen and did something she hadn't done before. She put both hands on either side of my face. Both hands, palms flat, steady, the way you hold something you want to look at clearly and completely. She looked at me, and what was in her face was not relief or gratitude or anything I'd have been able to predict. It was something older and quieter than all of that. The way you look at something that has become necessary to you, not wanted, not chosen as a preference, but necessary, woven in, part of how you're oriented now. She said, "You're a good man, Callum Greer." She said it the way you say a thing that is simply true, no weight on it beyond the truth, not a reward or a thank you. Just the fact of it, set down between us where we could both see it. I put my hands over hers where they were on my face and held them there a moment, not pulling her in, just holding that still. Then she stepped back and turned to the stove because it was getting on toward supper time, and the kitchen filled up with the smell of something good coming together, and I sat down at the table and neither of us said anything more, and that was exactly the right amount for what had just happened. Pruitt sold out in July. The Durango Bank called in the North Pasture note in June, and the rest of it unraveled quickly after that, the way these things do once the first domino falls. He sold the main ranch to a family from Kansas at a price that must have been painful and was gone before the month was out. I don't know where he went. Nobody in Garnet brought it up and I didn't ask. The valley felt different afterward, not in a dramatic way. It was quieter in a more ordinary way. The way a room settles when someone who talks too much has finally gone, and you realize you'd been spending half your attention accommodating the noise of them. What I noticed more than Prute's absence was what happened to Mara in his wake. She'd been doing accounts for 4 ranchers in the valley besides Prute, quietly, for wages that Prute usually found a way to intercept or argue away before they reached her. When that stopped, when she was doing the same work out of my office, with her name on it and fair wages paid to her directly, people started to see what had been in front of them the whole time. Not all at once. The valley moved the way valleys move, which is to say things circulated slowly and arrived with a kind of quiet inevitability rather than a moment of revelation. But over the course of that summer and fall, the Cotter Valley figured out who Mara was. The woman who'd been running the largest ranch in the valley nearly single-handed for 6 years, who'd been keeping the books for half a dozen operations, accurately and without credit, while a man with a loud voice took the reputation for all of it, who'd kept her ledger copies in the back of a drawer for 2 years, patient, waiting, because she'd understood the situation she was in more clearly than anyone else had been willing to. I watched the valley figure that out. I watched the Sutters look at her differently. I watched Mrs. Aldridge stop prefacing her name with poor. I watched Senora Vasquez, who did not give her regard easily, talk to Mara for 20 minutes at the dry goods counter one October morning with the manner of someone speaking to an equal. And I watched Mara stand up into it. Not with arrogance, she didn't have arrogance in her. With the quiet particular straightness of a person who has been required to make herself small for a long time and is finally being given the room not to. Watching, that was one of the finer things I have seen in my life. We married the following March. The wedding was small, the church in Garnet, a cold, bright morning, the Vasquez family and the Sutters and the Aldridges and Brennan who came up from Durango because he said he'd grown attached to both of us, which for Brennan was practically a declaration. The mountains still had their winter on them. What I remember from that day is not the ceremony, though it was fine and the preacher kept it short, and nobody cried until Mrs. Aldridge, which was expected. What I remember is standing outside the church afterward, the March light hard and flat the way it gets in the mountains, Mara beside me with her hand tucked into the crook of my arm, and Senora Vasquez saying something to her in Spanish, something low and warm that I didn't catch, and Mara laughing. A real laugh, the kind that starts from somewhere low in the body rather than from the mouth, the kind that has clearly been there a long time, waiting for something worth it. It went across the churchyard. The Vasquez boys grinned. Mrs. Aldridge dabbed her eye. I just stood there next to her with my hand over hers on my arm, feeling the warmth of her through my coat sleeve, thinking that this was the sound I wanted for the rest of whatever time I had. This specific sound. This particular woman's laugh in the cold mountain air. I had been a man standing at a fence line, watching something happen, and telling himself it wasn't his business. I had been a man who had built a careful quiet around himself out of competence and routine, and the particular numbness that sets into a person after loss if he lets it. And I had let it, and I had told myself it was peace when it was only absence. I don't know the exact moment those things stopped. There wasn't one moment. There was the flour sacks and the coffee and the coat I said was alone. There was the ledger on the table and her voice saying, "I'm not someone you protect from what's happening, I'm someone you bring into it." There was her hands on either side of my face and the plain true thing she said. But if you made me pick a day, a single point I could put my finger on, I'd pick the January morning she came into my yard on that sway-backed workhorse in the snow, bareback and without a coat, with everything she owned in a flour sack, and I told her she could stay. And she looked at me the way she looked at everything, carefully, running her calculations, not giving trust until she'd earned the right to trust it, and then she decided to believe me. That morning is when I stopped being a fence post. That morning is when I became the man I'd been meaning to be for 4 years. The creek still runs on the east side of the property. You can hear it from the porch when the wind is right, which is most evenings. I sit out there in the chair I built my second winter here, yellow pine, good and solid, and the mountains do what the mountains do, orange to purple to dark. The same slow show, night after night, patient as the valley itself. Mara comes out sometimes with a second cup of coffee. Sits in the other chair. She built that one herself the winter after we married, better joinery than mine. She'll point out if you ask, and she's right, and we sit together and the valley goes quiet and neither of us needs to fill it up. I spent a long time thinking the quiet was enough. The ordered routine of it. The competent, capable silence of a man who has closed himself off enough that nothing gets in but nothing gets out either, and he mistakes that for a kind of peace. It wasn't peace. I knew that before. I just had no way toward anything else. What I know now, on this porch, with the creek running and a good woman in the other chair who looked at me clear-eyed and decided I was worth staying for, is that the quiet is only any good when there's something in it. When there's someone beside you who knows you, who chose you freely, knowing exactly what they were choosing, then the quiet is a different thing entirely. Then it's full. That'll do for me, that'll do just fine.